Hi everybody, Grandad here again. And what am I up to today? Well, today I'm going to give you a little talk about another local hero, and he's a very interesting character, and it's quite an interesting story. I hope you're going to enjoy it. But to start with, as everybody knows, I live in Oswestry, but I used to live in Shrewsbury, which is about 12 miles from Oswestry in the county of Shropshire. And I lived in a part of the town which was not within a few, half a mile or so of Shrewsbury town centre itself. And just on the outskirts of the town there's an area called the Mount, and a famous person was actually born there. Now this person became world renowned, and I'll show you a picture of him. This is taken in his later life. Now, looking at that, I just wonder whether you recognise who it is. And he was born in Shrewsbury at Mount House, and I got a picture of Mount House here, and that's what it looked like. Now, it's not open to the public, unfortunately. I don't know why they never opened it to the public, but that's where his father lived, and he was a doctor, and his name was Darwin. Dr. Josiah Darwin, I think his name was, or something of that. And he married into a family, the Wedgwoods. His wife was a Wedgwood, and they got married, and they had several children. I don't know exactly how many children they had, but one of them they called Charles. And of course the person I'm talking about is Charles Darwin. Now, I've got a picture here which I believe is Charles Darwin as a young boy. I've looked it up and I've got this picture, and I rather fancy that was Charles Darwin as a young boy. Now, everyone knows about Charles Darwin, and he wrote a famous book called The Origin of Species. But that was later on in his life. But when he was a young boy and he went to school, he went to Shrewsbury School, which isn't the Shrewsbury School that we know today. It was in the old library, or at least it became a library and a museum in the centre of the town. And if ever you visit Shrewsbury and you go past that way, you'll see the old library on Castle Street, and sitting outside of it you'll see a statue of Charles Darwin sitting in a big chair. Now that's because obviously he was very famous later on in his life, but it shows him as an old gentleman there. But by then he'd moved and married and had children himself. I think he had 10 children. Incidentally, he actually married a Wedgwood himself. He actually married his cousin, which was quite interesting. Quite often that happened in those days. But he married his cousin, and she was a Wedgwood, and they had about 10 children, but 3 died quite young. Now, Charles Darwin, as a young boy, he was very interested in nature, even as a young boy. And that picture I showed you there, which undoubtedly is him, was him looking at some flowers. And he was sort of obviously interested in flowers and bugs and different things like that, even as a young boy. And when he grew up, I mean, he went to school, as I say, in Shrewsbury, but he wasn't very academic. He didn't really like school much, I don't think, and he didn't do very well at school. He wasn't a great scholar. He was more interested in nature, I think. His father wanted him to go into, because he was a doctor, and he wanted him to go into medicine as well, but Charles didn't like medicine. He didn't like the idea of chopping up bodies and doing things like that. That didn't appeal to him at all, and I think he was probably a bit squeamish, and he didn't really like doing operations and things. So that's sort of going into a doctorate. Although he went to a good school and he got some qualifications, I suppose, he didn't really want to do that. So they didn't really know. I think they wanted him to go into the church at one time, because Charles Darwin's family was very rich. I mean, as I say, his father was a doctor. They had plenty of money. So it wasn't that he ever needed to make a living. And in fact, he never did any of his, during his lifetime, he never really did anything to earn money. He did it as a pure studying things and finding out about the things that were happening in the world, and he compiled his interest. But his father didn't really know what to do with him, or what he wanted to do himself. So when he got a bit older, I think he was sort of in his 20s or so, his father was trying to find and this is a picture of him probably when he was in his 20s or so. I mean, that's a little bit later on in his life. At the age of about 20, he managed to get, well, it wasn't really a job. It was, there was a chap by the name of Fitzroy, and he was a captain on a ship. And they were going to do a journey, a journey of sort of exploration, and doing surveys and maps and things like that in that sort of line. And they were going on a 5-year trip in a ship called the Beagle. Now, Captain Fitzroy not only wanted a naturalist or some sort of person to look at the nature of the things they've discovered while they were on their journey, so they wanted somebody that was interested in nature and the naturalist to go along on the journey, but also Fitzroy, Captain Fitzroy, wanted someone who could be a companion. And the idea of Charles Darwin going on this journey with Captain Fitzroy on his ship, because you remember that this is the days when ships were only sailing ships, and I got a picture on this little book here, and it says the name of the ship there. It was called the Beagle. And I got a picture of it there, and I've got another picture which I'll show you in a minute, which gives you a better idea of what the Beagle was like. And so this trip was going to be quite a long trip. They were going to be on the ship for at least 5 years, doing this survey work and visiting tropical islands all over the world, and mapping and looking at the nature and wildlife. So this appealed to Charles, and he decided to go off on this journey. So he set off on the Beagle and went on this massive, I mean, it must have been, for a young man, it must have been really exciting, the idea of travelling the world in a sailing ship. Now, as I say, I've got a picture here of the ship. Now, it wasn't a very big ship, the Beagle. I mean, it wasn't a massive ship. I got a picture of it here. I believe this is the Beagle. And as you can see, it's a 3-master. It was probably a converted coal ship. I don't know what it actually was, what kind of ship it was, but it wasn't a very big ship. And to live on there for 5 years, cooped up in a cabin and visiting various strange places. But this book that I've got here, which I showed you a brief look at, is a little book. It's a bit tatty, and it was actually published, I think it was, as I say, the cover of it's all falling to pieces, unfortunately. But let's have a little look if I can see when this book was actually... Yeah, this was 1958 when this was second printing of this book. And it's quite interesting because this book, as the title says, The Voyage of the Beagle by Charles Darwin. All the time while he was out there, he wrote a little journal and kept a record of everything that happened on the ship and where he went. And when he came back, he wrote not this particular, this as a copy of his original book, which he had written about his journey on the thing. And there's a little footnote here which I might just read to give you an idea about Charles Darwin. It says, I was born, Charles Robert Darwin, actually his name was. Charles Robert Darwin was born in Shrewsbury in 1809. Grandson of the famous Dr. Esme Darwin. He studied in Shrewsbury School under Samuel Butler and then at Edinburgh and took a degree, 10th in his class at Cambridge in 1831. Shortly after coming to a 5-year voyage, his 5-year voyage on the Beagle, where he began his observations, investigations and collaborating the facts of nature, which led to the formation of his theory of evolution, Darwinism. has had a profound and lasting effect on the early field of biology and natural history. Now that I've read this little book, even though it's in a tatty state, there's no pictures in it or even drawings, but there's an awful lot of information there, and it tells you like a day-to-day journey of Darwin on the Beagle, and I find it very interesting. It's a little bit tatty now, but I like to keep that. But Darwin wrote a good many books. I've got another book here written by Charles Darwin, and this one is called The Descent of Man by Darwin. Now this is probably more likely what the books would have looked like that Darwin himself will have wrote. I don't know had printed. I don't quite know how old this book is. I think I might, if I can find a date. This one's dated 1885 and it's called The Descent of Man. Selection in relation to sex. Now that's quite interesting. I haven't read all this book, but there's some quite interesting bits in it about how man came to be on the earth and different things, and there's quite a lot of other things to study in here as well. There's several pictures of let's have a little look at what we've got. Oh, I missed it already, but there are pictures in this book, which if I got pictures I like to show them to you if I can. They're of any interest. But looking at various weird and wonderful creatures, there's one picture there of a strange, looks more like a pike, I don't know what it is exactly. Oh, it's a common salmon. I thought it looked like a fish. And there's a lot in here about fish and how they evolved, and I'm sure, oh, and then he goes on to apes, because as we know, Charles Darwin was the great ape man. He was the one that put up this very controversial book about the evolution of mankind, and this was a great worry to him. I mean, I haven't got a copy of the actual original type book, which would have been a book very similar to this one, that Charles Darwin actually wrote on the origin of species, as it was called. But I actually bought a book which is The Origin of Species, and this is it here, and it's a wonderful volume. It's even got its own box. It fits in this box to protect it, which is why it's in such good condition. And it's all gold leaf on the inside. Now this is a copy, and this is probably one of the most expensive books I ever bought. I think I paid about £25 for this book, and it's a beautiful book. And it was this is dated 2006, so it's quite a recent book, but it's got some beautiful pictures in it, sort of relating to Darwin. There's some beautiful cover picture there of butterflies and things, and there's some wonderful plates in this book. If I can find them quickly without as usual, when you want to find things you can't. I think the plates are here. Now, Charles Darwin, there's a beautiful picture there of a bird of paradise. These are the sort of birds that he would have come across on his voyage, and the pictures are in here, different things that he came across. Now, as I say, I'm interested in Charles Darwin because I actually was born within half a mile of where he was born, and I can quite imagine the places that he walked up and wandered about as a young boy would have been the same places that I went. Another thing that interested him greatly was beetles. I mean, he had a great interest in beetles, and he wrote essays on beetles as well as limpets and earthworms, I mean, and pigeons. I mean, he wrote a great many books and papers, scientific papers on books. But you must remember that Charles Darwin, as I say, he had independent wealth. He was the son of a wealthy doctor, so money was no object to him, and so he didn't need to make a living. And so he was able to study things in great detail. And I mean, it took years for him to formulate his Origin of Species, and wrote the book, this book that I'm looking at. All the details of it. don't know what that's about. If that's anything of interest. I'll just check that out while I'm here. Oh, there's interesting. There's a little peeps I've taken out of the newspaper, and apparently they found a clock or a chronometer of some sort that George Darwin had on his ship. And there's another picture of the Beagle there, and Charles Darwin. How many people know what he looked like? So that's interesting. But in this book that he wrote, it took him a long time, and for a long time he didn't want to publish this book. He actually wrote up the manuscript and wrapped it up, put it in a cupboard, because his wife was quite religious, and a lot of the text in this book goes against religion, and so he was worried that there would be outcry, which there was when he published it eventually, outcry that they were trying to go against the Bible and what it said in the Bible about evolution and God making everything in his own image and creating everything. Well, Darwin proved that it was a thing called natural selection that determined the origin of species, and we all come to be here through natural selection of animals and plants and creatures, evolving from one creature turning into another creature. And all this information which he gathered as a result of this trip on the Beagle, going to places like the Galapagos Islands and looking at different things. But one of the interesting things about this, and something which I've got to mention, and it's even mentioned in this book, I can't find the picture, the exact picture which I showed you of this other part which I'm going to enlighten you about, but I've got it here on my camera, on my phone. And that is that although Darwin is credited with the formulation of the book on evolution, and he gets the most praise, there was another gentleman that was working totally different to Darwin. He was working in a field of collecting and gathering of natural specimens, and he did it for a living. I mean, this man was not from a wealthy background. He wasn't poor, but he wasn't certainly wealthy as Darwin was. So he had to earn a living, and he earned his living by travelling the world gathering specimens, and he was very interested in beetles and bugs and butterflies and all that sort of thing. And there was a great craze during the Victorian times when Darwin was about for collecting specimens, so people would pay quite a lot of money. And this chap, and his name is Alfred Russel Wallace, and there's a picture of him. That's a bit later in his life, and there's actually a picture of Alfred Russel Wallace in this book of Darwin's, because strangely enough Wallace came to exactly the same conclusions about evolution and the origin of species as Darwin did. And strangely enough, Darwin, as I say, had put his paper's work away, and he wasn't thinking about publishing it because of the controversy that it would cause and the upset to his wife. So he was very concerned when he got... there's another picture of Darwin in here, it's a bit later on. Another good picture of Darwin in this book. Later on, Wallace... And there's a picture of Wallace in Darwin's book, dressed up in his garb. It looks a bit like Indiana Jones there. That's Wallace. He sent a paper to Darwin outlining his interests and what he'd discovered, and asking Darwin what he should do about it. Well, Darwin was quite shocked, because Wallace had come up with exactly the same idea of evolution as he had. So what they decided to do, and Darwin being quite a gentleman, I suppose, in a way, and Wallace certainly was a gentleman because he had no objection to it, they presented the papers to the various authorities in those days that needed to know about these things, and they presented their papers both at the same time. So that, there wasn't any... I mean, Darwin had written his papers several years before Wallace had, and Wallace incidentally was about 14 years younger than Darwin, but they both come to the same conclusion, and obviously Darwin thought it was only right that Wallace should present his paper as well, so that they put the two things together. But of course Darwin, because he was wealthy maybe, I don't know, got more interest in it, and he's been put down as the man that sort of discovered evolution. But Wallace had a great influence on it, and he knew a great deal about it. In fact, Wallace discovered other things. One of the great things that Wallace discovered was that in a part of where he went, I think it was, I don't know, Indonesia or Madagascar or somewhere like that, I can't remember, there's an area of islands which are divided by an invisible line, which now is known as the Wallace line, and where you've got Asian animals, I think, on the one side of this line, and on the other side you've got Australian animals. And Wallace for a long time couldn't figure out how this could be. I mean, he knew about the fact that animals that were on islands were isolated, and therefore they changed and evolved into a new species. But he couldn't fathom out why on a strip of water, which wasn't that wide, it was only about 20 some odd miles wide, how the animals were so different on either side of it. Well, they didn't know at that time, but of course what Wallace had discovered without knowing it was plate tectonics and continental drift. Now we know exactly what all that is about, and the fact that the Earth has moved about all over the place, and India has moved up and crashed into the Alps, or created the Alps by crashing into the continent of Asia, and different parts of America were actually in two separate pieces that crashed together. So we now understand why, and the mechanism of plate tectonics has told us how all these things come about. But it was thanks to Wallace and his observations that this was able to be found out and recognised. And even today Wallace has got this, as I say, an area they call the Wallace Line, where he discovered this particular strange area where the animals were totally different. So that was quite a thing, and they both, I mean, you'd think that they would perhaps have been enemies because they were both vying for the same idea, but Wallace and Darwin, I think they got on pretty well. I mean, Darwin got most of the credit, and he's world famous for his Origin of Species, and he deserves the credit for that, because he did do an awful lot of work on it, and obviously he had got the ideas and the things that gave him the ideas for the Origin of Species on the Beagle, which was several years before Wallace was about. But he didn't, Wallace was able to finalise and get the information together, and they've sort of published it together as a gentlemanly way of resolving the problem of the fact that they both came to the same result. Now, the fact that they both discovered it meant that they sort of should have shared the glory, but Darwin, for whatever reason, got most of the credit, and I think Wallace became ill from his travels and his hardships. He had malaria and goodness knows what, and I think he died quite young, Wallace. I don't know exactly when he died, whether I got information on that. But what I suggest you do, if you're interested in Darwin and the evolution of species and the trip of the Beagle, try and get hold of one of these books if you can. But if failing that, look on the internet, and there's some great videos and some people telling you all about Darwin and his exploits, and of course Wallace and all his exploits. So I think that'll conclude my little talk on Charles Darwin. I mean, I more or less concentrate on Darwin because he lived in the same town that I was born, and so that's of interest to me. I don't know, let's have a little look if I've got anything that I wanted to. Oh, I'm not very good with these phones, but it's the only way I can get the pictures up. I think I showed you. Oh, that I believe. It's not a terribly good picture, but this is a picture of one of the Wedgwood girls. Now I'm not sure which one that is. I don't know whether it's Charles Darwin's wife. It might be, but I wouldn't want to swear to it because I may have got it wrong. But if you look on, because Darwin left Shrewsbury, he didn't live in Shrewsbury, he went to a place called Down House, I think, in Kent or somewhere like that, I don't know. But what you do is get on your internet and look up Charles Darwin and you'll see all about him. But don't forget to look up Wallace as well and get his story, because they're two great men working together to bring us all the information that we need, that we know today, and without their help things would have been perhaps very different. I don't know, maybe we still wouldn't know what there was if we hadn't got these people going out there and studying nature and looking at it, and they dedicated their lives to it. So it's all very interesting, and I think I'll close now, and that's the end of my little story about Charles Darwin. But look him up and find out all about him. Anyway, bye bye now. Bye bye.